Welcome to today's Explainer. We're taking a massive, totally chaotic list of rapid-fire chess tips and organizing them into one masterful strategic playbook. We are going to distill a ton of strategic wisdom from our source material into a perfectly structured guide, walking you through literally every single phase of a chess match. Let's get right into it. So, here's our chronological roadmap to total board domination. First up, surviving the opening. Then, pawns in the center, followed by the minor piece battle, heavy artillery and rooks, endgame rules and trading, and finally, the master mindset. All right, Section 1, surviving the opening, develop or die. This first phase, it's all about surviving those crucial first moves without just getting absolutely crushed. As one grandmaster put it, the golden rule here is literally develop or die. To survive, there are a few strict rules you absolutely have to follow. If you bring your queen out early, or if you're moving the same piece twice, you're just wasting turns. Your opponent's going to continually attack that early queen, forcing you to move her again and again while they freely develop their own pieces. I mean, what are you doing with your life? Develop quickly. Get your knights, bishops, and queen off that back rank. And honestly, most importantly, make sure you castle early. Ideally, do it before move 10. That's going to keep your king super safe and connect your rooks for the battles ahead. Now here is the absolute biggest psychological trap for beginners. You can never, ever play hope chess. So hope chess is when you make a move secretly hoping your opponent makes a specific blunder or, just doesn't see your brilliant plan. Bad idea. You must always assume your opponent is going to play the absolute best possible move and plan your strategy around that. Moving on to Section 2, pawns and the center and how we control the board. Look, the center is hands down the most overpowered area of the game. If you control it, it becomes incredibly difficult for your opponent to get anything done at all. But to control the center, you absolutely must avoid these specific structural pawn weaknesses. On one side, we have doubled pawns. That's two pawns of the same color stuck on the exact same file. Because they're lined up vertically, they literally can't defend each other, making them super prone to attack. On the flip side, we have isolated and backward pawns. These are pawns that have kind of been left behind or separated from their brothers, and with no nearby pawns to back them up, they become massive, incredibly easy targets for your opponent to just pick off. But what happens when your opponent builds a perfectly connected pawn chain that's just eating up a ton of space? Well, when you face a strong connected chain like that, the absolute crucial point is to attack the base pawn. Think of it like a building. The entire chain relies on that single bottommost pawn for its structural integrity. Once you destroy that base, the rest of the pawns become totally unsupported and you can just scoop them up one by one. And okay, we definitely have to mention the legendary en passant rule. Our source material literally jokingly calls it a way of life. To illustrate just how highly regarded this move is, they actually share an anecdote about a player named Bobby. Bobby faced a choice: checkmate his opponent or play en passant. And being an absolute king, Bobby chose en passant, deliberately sacrificing the game just to play the move. I mean, you gotta respect it. All right, Section 3, the minor piece battle, knights versus bishops. As we enter the middle game, it's important to understand something. While it's generally best to develop knights before bishops in the opening, mostly because you almost always know exactly which squares the knights are going to jump to, their utility completely diverges in the mid-game. Remember, bishops absolutely thrive in open positions. That's where they can control squares and launch these wild, unexpected attacks from afar. But if the board is closed and totally clogged up with pawns, bishops just become trapped. Now, knights, they are the exact opposite. They're a bit sluggish in wide open space, but they are your ultimate weapon on a closed, cramped board because they can just hop right over the gridlock. Plus, they happen to be the absolute best pieces for blockading enemy pawns. So a really great rule of thumb here is to avoid trading your long-range bishops for knights whenever possible. Bishops are generally considered slightly superior just because of that sweeping range. And definitely keep your knights in the center of the board. You know how they say, knights on the rim are grim? It's true. A knight on the edge of the board only controls 2 squares, but a knight placed happily in the center, it controls a whopping 8 squares. You gotta keep them productive. Now let's talk about the number 6. 6 represents the material point value of a rook and a pawn combined. Interestingly enough, it is also the combined material value of 2 minor pieces. So you might be wondering, should you make that trade? Well, actually, it's usually a very bad idea. Why? because those two minor pieces can control significantly more squares and coordinate together to deliver much, much stronger attacks than a single rook and a pawn ever could. Let's move to Section 4, Heavy Artillery and Rooks, and how we unleash their power. All right, let's step up the firepower and look at your heavy artillery, the rooks. These pieces are absolute monsters, but only if you know how to unleash them correctly. The crucial thing to remember is that rooks desperately need open lines to thrive. As you can see, their effectiveness just skyrockets as files open up. On a completely closed file, rooks are miserable. They can't make progress, and it often leads to a dead draw. But give them a semi-open file, suddenly they've got strong attacking potential. And if you manage to get your rooks onto a fully open file, they become incredibly powerful and a massive, massive problem for your opponent. And here's a pro tip. If you can push your rooks all the way up to the 7th rank if you're playing white, or the 2nd rank if you're black, you are going to put your opponent in deep, deep trouble. This rank is where most of your opponent's undefended pawns live, which means you can just gobble them up one by one. Not to mention, lining up your rooks here creates some incredibly nasty checkmate threats. To really maximize this power, you gotta remember to connect your rooks early on. You do this by moving your queen out of the way so your two rooks can physically see and protect each other on the back rank. Another honestly brilliant tactic is to always place your rooks directly behind your own passed pawns. This perfectly protects the pawn as it marches toward promotion, all while ensuring the rook stays highly active and keeps its mobility. It's a total win-win. Section 5. Endgame rules and treating, or knowing exactly when to simplify. So as the heavy artillery does its damage and the board starts clearing out, you're faced with an absolute game changer in endgame strategy. If you have a material advantage and you are winning, you want to trade pieces to simplify the board and guarantee your win. But, and this is a big but, do not trade your pawns. You need those pawns to promote. Conversely, if you're losing, your goal is to trade off all the pawns while keeping your pieces. Think about it. If you eliminate all the pawns, even a world champion like Magnus Carlsen couldn't beat you. Because without pawns to promote, the game frequently forces a theoretical draw. And what about opposite-colored bishops? Well, they create these wild dynamics that completely flip depending on the phase of the game. In the middle game, having bishops of opposite colors is highly, highly dangerous. Because they attack entirely different sets of squares, one bishop can launch an unstoppable lethal attack that the enemy bishop can literally never defend against. But in the endgame, the dynamic completely reverses. Opposite-colored bishops become incredibly drawish, often resulting in flat, theoretical ties even when one side has a huge material advantage. We also absolutely cannot talk about the endgame without talking about the king. While your king was a complete liability that needed to hide safely in a castle during the opening, in the endgame, it transforms into an absolute god. I mean it. The moment the board clears, you have to bring your king out to the center of the board as fast as possible. An active endgame king is a total powerhouse that will aggressively march forward to scoop up enemy pawns. Finally, Section 6, the master mindset. Breaking the rules. We've covered a lot of strict structural rules in this explainer, but the fundamental mindset of a master is actually pretty simple. When you see a good move, look for a better move. A rookie might spot a decent capture and feel pretty great about it. A grandmaster, like Hikaru, might instantly see a devastating knight move for an immediate knockout. But you must pause and look even closer. Because a Magnus Carlsen-level player might spot something even more elusive and brilliant on the board, like a devastating on-passant that takes total advantage of the entire board state. And that, my friends, brings us to the ultimate paradox of chess strategy. We just spent this entire explainer meticulously detailing the absolute laws of the board. But to truly master the game, you must first deeply learn all of these structural principles just so you know the exact perfect moment to brilliantly ignore them. So, leaving you with this final thought. Are you ready to learn the rules well enough to finally break them?